Hi, I'm Yulia, and this is Burning Questions. The topic that has set the internet on fire this week is how are all of the changes in the Middle East, namely in Gaza with the ceasefire and in Syria with the fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime, are going to influence the global West and the politics around it.
Hello, my name is Marcin Krzyzanowski. I'm a lecturer at Jagiellonian University and expert at Warsaw Institute.
Amazing. And can you tell us a little bit more about the topics that you specialize in?
My main specialization is Middle Eastern policy and economy, also human rights and universal human rights as a field of ideological conflict between West and East, and of course asymmetric conflicts in the Middle East area.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I think it's a very relevant. It's a relevant field always, but I think right now it's a very, very relevant field based on like everything that's happening in the world and the big sort of kind of a standoff between the West and the East and the values and everything that's happening, and of course Russia and Russian grip on the Middle East that to me seems incredibly far-fetched and should be impossible, but somehow exists. So obviously, there are a lot of events that had happened recently that kind of shook up Russia's ability to hold a grip on the Middle East and to spread their propaganda, namely the events in Syria. How do you think the fall of the Assad regime and what happened in Syria affects not just Syria and Syria's alliances, but also the countries around it and the countries allied to Syria through the Arab world?
A threat of political power vacuum in Syria. Fortunately for the region, Syrians were able to avoid, although the civil war in Syria is far from the conclusion. At the moment, after the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime, instead of Iran, Turkey and partially Qatar place itself as the main political players in Syria. The Iranian so-called axis of resistance was badly damaged by the fall of the regime. Although the relations between Iranians and Assad regime were strained in the last few months, Syria was a very important part of the chain of supply stretching from Tehran in Iran to Beirut in Lebanon. Iran was able to use Syria, Bashar al-Assad controlled territory, to supply its main asset in the region, which is the Hezbollah organization. At the moment, supplying Hezbollah is much more complicated for Iran, yet still possible. Also, there is the fall of the regime is a huge gap to general anti-aircraft defense of Iran. Previously, when the main part of Syrian territory was under control of Bashar al-Assad, it was much harder for Israel to use Syrian airspace. Of course, Israel poses air superiority or domination in the region, but still Syrian radars could make eventual airstrike on Iran more complicated. Now there is virtually no anti-aircraft defense in Syria as Israel has destroyed it. So the free airspace for Israeli airplanes is much bigger and much closer to the Iranian borders. But the main blow after fall of Bashar al-Assad regime came straight into Russia's face, as in Syria two main foreign bases of the Russian army are located. I'm talking about airbase in Khmeim and the naval base in Tartus.
Mm-hmm.
At the moment, the fate of those bases is under threat. as the new Syrian government is not happy with the Russian presence in Syria. The Russians, they were forced to move their units from smaller bases to those aforementioned two. And they are trying to evacuate those bases from Syria to Libya, which make the projection of Russian power in the Middle East and Africa region more complicated, as bases in Libya are simply farther from Russia mainland and located in a less strategically important area.
Yeah, well, generally, the fate of Russian presence and the fate of a lot of different things in Syria are kind of under question right now because, as you mentioned, the new government, but the new government is not fully formed. For instance, I have friends who are journalists who spend the new year and consecutively a couple of weeks after that in Syria talking about chemical attacks and Russian propaganda and a lot of things that Russia helped Assad execute and concealed, and, the lies in front of the International Criminal Court. These two journalists are Audrey McAlpin and Kaylin Robertson. You might have seen them around, and if you haven't, then they're brilliant. Yeah. So they have been to Syria, and, they have talked about the situation, and the situation on the ground is quite ridiculous. There is no police. There are many armed civilians that just have guns. There is a lot of violence. There is a lot of crime going on. To me, it sort of resembles, the Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus of the 1990s when the Soviet Union fell and no one really knew what was going on. And it's always like
the similars are very clear.
Yeah, it's a very tumultuous time always when, when a dictator regime falls or a regime falls, because until you kind of can rebuild and you can build a democracy or whatever other form of government you would like to implement, it takes time because for all of the, you can't rely on the current police officers, you can't rely on the current judges, you can't rely on the current prison system because all of the people that were there under a dictator regime are loyal to the dictator regime, right? Or were. So
that's correct.
And
that's correct.
And that's a lot of employees to find, and they have to be qualified in what they're doing. So
running a state is much more complicated than waging a war. Even the current not dictator, not president, current leader of the not even whole Syria, because except HDS and Giuliani government, there are also various smaller rebel groups, as for example Kurds, as for example Syrian so-called Syrian National Army, not to mention the remnants of Islamic State, etc., etc. So as we said before, first of all, there is a necessity to govern such big territory from Idlib to Damascus, but still, at the same time, civil war is definitely not over.
Well, of course, there are so many different influences on Syria that are going to try and keep their influence or strengthen their influence, different groups under the rebels. The rebels are not a homogenous body as well, and there are different regions in Syria that prefer different sort of alliances, and it's very interesting how it's going to play out. Of course, I wish them all the best, and I think with the rest of the world, other than Russia, I'm excited for them to sort of have a taste of a free world. It's at least nice that they now have unrestricted media, and women are not forced to into the policy of modesty, and there is a lot of positive change happening for sure. But of course, that's just we will see how it plays out, because these are the sort of initial things. Now on the other side, there is Gaza and Israel, or rather Palestine and Israel, and President Biden was able to negotiate a ceasefire deal just recently between Israel and Hamas. And I sort of want to try and formulate my opinion without kind of like diminishing the events that are going on there. But certainly there is a very big situation between Israel and Gaza. Certainly there are a lot of victims in Hamas, and I think there is a lot of political play. Victims in Hamas, oh my gosh, victims in Gaza. And certainly, there is it's not a straightforward situation. There are a lot of different things happening. It's a very long, it's a very, very long conflict. But this conflict has been very much weaponized by Russia in order to undermine the West and the Western values and the Western kind of alliance to Israel. And it's while, I have my own opinion that is not relevant here, but I do think that while a lot of people simply call, what we're seeing in the news space just Israel propaganda, there is definitely a lot of Russian propaganda that paints Hamas as a lot better than they are and uses a lot of the Middle Eastern nations in their own interests. So now that there is going to be a ceasefire deal, and now that this is going on, how does that influence Russia's politics of using and abusing the Middle East in its own interests?
Each kind of ceasefire will make Russian influence weaken as Russia is always and everywhere trying to use ongoing conflict for its own profit. Russia is trying to manipulate not only the narration about any given conflict, but is trying to meddle in the conflict by supporting sometimes at the same time both sides against each other. And as you mentioned, and this time Russia was trying to picture Hamas as not as terrorists, but more like freedom fighters against the Western so-called neo-imperial or post-imperial, depending on the source, politics. Russia in the Middle East and in Africa is trying to position itself, trying to picture itself as a kind of liberator again in the fight against oppressor. Oppressors are always the Western country, the Russia. Russia is trying to whitewash itself from its own colonial past by playing the card of colonialism. And unfortunately for us, in the Middle East and Africa, such propaganda will receive warm welcome, as we need to admit that the colonial history made a mark over Middle Eastern and African societies. Russia itself, a former empire, trying to regain imperial glory as a former colonial power, as we Poles knew it from it, is trying to position itself not as a colonial post-colonial power, but anti-colonial power. The propaganda created during Soviet Union time is also a very useful tool for them, and they are widely using it. We can try to repulse, we can try to defend ourselves against Russia allegations, but it is complicated as they are very skillful in the art of lies.
Yeah, well, it's actually a very interesting dynamic, right? Because, and I don't want to generalize, but the Arab world in general, regardless of the country, is a very tight-knit society, and they're tight-knit because of sort of the religious persecution that has been going around in the world against Muslims and against all things Arabic, because I mean it's a very different culture, it's a very different religion, it's very different. We tend as societies as a whole to persecute and not like something that differs from the norm, right? Or from whatever the perceived norm is. And so in the Western world, there is a lot of scrutiny. So I think that Arab nations stick together and sort of they support each other because they have each other. And I think the interesting thing is that as we look at the Arab countries, most of them support Russia, and it's a pretty homogenous opinion, right? Of course, it's because of the decades of propaganda, but also because of this homogeny that's going on there. So Syria, taking a different approach and meeting with the Ukrainian officials and setting up an embassy and talking about how they support Ukraine and kind of giving this. It's like if you look at a house, a brick has fallen out. right? And
That's correct.
that's a crack. It might seem minor to some people, but in reality, this is a very, very big deal because once all of these secrets are going to start coming out of Syria, of Russia, helping conceal chemical attacks, of Russia helping conceal deaths, of Russia helping torture people, of Russia really not acting as this like big saving grace. This is going to rub a lot of other nations the wrong way. Because I think there is this idea, and I've heard this from a lot of people from the Middle East and a lot of people from Africa, that, well, Russia never colonized us. Right? Russia never has done anything. The West has, but Russia hasn't. So Russia is the good guy. But the thing is,
That's true.
Russia didn't have
That's
to go spread its imperialism in the Middle East and in Africa because it had its own backyard, its neighbors. They didn't colonize you not because they are good. They didn't colonize you because it's too far and too many resources. However, that is also a very wrong opinion today because Russia is, in fact, spreading its imperialism and colonizing a lot of African nations. And also, as we're seeing with Syria and other Middle Eastern countries, it's not necessarily colonialism, but it's kind of like it's a malicious manipulation because they don't necessarily care how they influence the situation within the country or their standing or their internal and external affairs, as long as they can take it and use it and twist it in its own interest. So the situation in Syria is great on both ends, both for, democracy for Syria and also because I'm thinking that Russia's propaganda and influence is going to be, the card house is definitely starting to fall and it's not nearly as strong as it was. But my interest is, right, for an average viewer who's looking at the Middle East and is looking at Russia, especially people who are aware of Russia, they're looking at Russia and they know these couple of things, right? Russia has the highest rates of AIDS, potentially in the civilized world. Civilized. We're talking about Russia here, but let's let them have it. Russia has one of the highest rates of divorce and domestic violence and violence against women. Russia has one of the highest rates of alcoholism. Russia has one of the highest rates of imprisonment of people and just rogue criminals running around the streets. So it's far away from this idea of very deotic society that loves God and has Christian values and has these strong men and beautiful women that live in harmony together. While in the Middle East, the values of a nuclear family, not drinking, not there is very harsh punishments for crimes, AIDS is also kind of frowned upon, and so is everything that Russia really is. How did Russia manage to convince these societies that they are similar in values and in the order of life?
That's a mystery. That's a mystery that can be solved very easily. We have to admit that Russians are very skillful in the matter of propaganda and the art of manipulation. As you said, Russia, being country with a rotten society, was able to picture itself as a conservative, based on Christian Orthodox values country. At the same time, they were able to bomb rebels in the name of Bashar al-Assad, and pictured itself as a liberators from the Western oppression. Unfortunately, modern societies using modern medias, including social medias and real-time information access, that's a paradox, more prone to be manipulated, as the influx of the information is too big to control it, too big to filter it properly without a great effort. So as Russia, basing on the old Soviet school of propaganda, was simply able to manipulate public opinion in many Muslim countries, for example, as Jordan, as Iran, as partially Iraq and Lebanon. And once again, Russia is able to play over the regional conflicts, and by being quite distant, it's easier for Russia to manipulate. Many Western countries present in the region need to face the Russian propaganda and Russian disinformation, which will overstate the all Western sins. Because let's be honest, Western countries weren't always the good guys in the region, although they were trying and still try. And once again, Russia is able to manipulate information and to create a picture of itself, which is more like so-called famous Potemkin village or only facade, not the reality.
Yeah, I apologize for that. That's the end of an air raid in Kyiv, and there is absolutely no way I can silence these notifications. So,
I hope you are safe.
Yeah, it's just drones. I'm not going to go into the pyramid of my thinking of what's danger because that's just not good information to propagate. But I tend to think that drones in Kyiv, particularly, are not that much of a threat because we have pretty decent air defense. My next sort of question is more of your personal opinion, but I'm very curious. So there is this tendency in the West because a lot of Western youth especially hates legacy media because, and I quote, they always lie. And I understand where this sort of hatred is coming from because you, at this day and age, can get a lot more information from TikTok, for instance, or something similar with a lot less censorship and a lot less political speak and political correctness than you can from legacy media. Also, obviously, creators on TikTok that do political content are not being paid to spread specific narratives while legacy media is influenced by its sponsors. So there is also this new tendency to get your information from Al Jazeera, especially from the people that tend to follow the Israel-Gaza war very closely. And they seem to think that Al Jazeera is way less biased because Al Jazeera is in the Middle East, and of course it's not a Western legacy media, and they don't have their sort of motives for publishing what they publish. They just speak their mind. What do you think of this idea, and what do you think of Al Jazeera and Middle Eastern publications as like the correct beacon of as the beacon of like correct information in the English-speaking world?
And for sure, in many cases, Al Jazeera can be treated as a reliable source, but always with a pinch of salt. Although it's not shared, it's not sharing the Western legacy in the region, but still is it's government controlled medium, government control news agency, television, websites, etc., as it's a tool created for its own purposes by the government of Qatar. And Qatar is also one of the major, although tiny, tiny sized, but still very powerful player in the Middle East. So although the perspective of Al Jazeera is very useful, as usual, it's quite different from the Western media's perspective, still we can't trust it 100%. Every information should be taken with at least a pinch of salt, especially those controversial, those related to controversial topics, as for example Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or any political activity the government of Qatar is involved in. At the war, the first victim is through, and every and every Middle Eastern television, every Middle Eastern media is a tool, or let's call it a weapon in the information war.
Of course. Would it be fair to say that Qatar is quite a friendly nation to Russia, and that should be taken into the account when a viewer or a reader reads articles and information coming from Al Jazeera that have that speak about conflicts or politics that has Russia's or Qatari interests in it?
Definitely yes. From one hand, Qatar is a close ally to the United States. It is labeled by the Washington government as one of the so-called major non-NATO ally. But at the same time, Qatar is trying to distance itself from the Western policy, and in many cases works hand by hand with Russians, especially if there is a chance to play over the ongoing conflict, and then the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can be major example of it. We have to remember that the Al Jazeera office in the West Bank was closed not by Israelis but the Palestinian authorities, the fellow Arabs, because the Palestinian authority considers Al Jazeera as unreliable source and part of the conflict, part of the information war. So once again, although Al Jazeera present very interesting perspective, still it's a part of a wider picture and part of the informational war.
What types of shifts should we expect to see within the geopolitical sphere of influence of, Middle Eastern countries and Russia now that the situation in Gaza is reaching a sort of resolution, now that the situation in Syria has reached a very large resolution? Obviously, again, we've mentioned that it's far from being over, but what sort of dynamics and change in dynamics and influence and geopolitics should we expect to see in the coming months or even this year?
For sure, we will see a lot of turmoil as President Donald Trump will start his second term. And the influence of Washington over the Middle Eastern affairs is still a very important factor. Although Russia is trying to picture the West, especially United States, as being weak, being rotten, and being defenseless, it's not true. Washington still is the major player in the area and still is controlling the situation, although without problems. For sure, in the next few weeks, maybe months, but I think more weeks, we will witness a stagnation. Most of the ongoing conflict will be less intensified than it used to be. For sure, we will have few weeks of relatively calm time in Gaza. Possibly Houthis will finish their anti-Israeli campaign, and the Suez Canal road will be once again fully open to every ship, every country ship. And for sure, we will witness Iranians trying to regain their influence over Syria, and Russians trying to defend, let's call it like that, defend their presence in Syria, as the bases in Khmeimim and Tartus are crucial for their projection of power in the region. Without those bases, Russian influence will be crippled down. However, in Syria, we will see more political fights, and most probably we will witness a very intensive negotiation between Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia over the fate of Syria and political future of Lebanon. Unfortunately for the Middle East and the whole world, the ongoing conflicts will stay with us for much longer.
Of course. What do you think, as someone who is very as someone who is very well informed about the information space in the Middle East? So, of course, we know that in Europe, Donald Trump, as a leader and as the president of the United States, is sort of taken as a laughing stock that no one really wants to work with, but is obligated to. Then, there's opinions in Ukraine, there's opinions in Asia, in various different places in Asia, but also they seem to be homogenous as well. And there's quite a consensus here about Donald Trump in the rest of the world, other than Russia, Iran, and North Korea. What is the Middle Eastern, and of course, again, I understand there are lots of countries, but sort of consensus-like, right? What's the region's opinion of Donald Trump as a leader, and kind of how are they taking the news of him coming back to office?
To be honest, no one is sure about what to exactly expect from him. He is extremely pro-Israeli, that's for sure. But at the same time, he is trying to create new political structure in the Middle East. We have to remember about his main Middle East initiative, so-called Abrahamian Records. Which were hampered by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. At the same time, he's trying to pursue maximum pressure campaign against Iran. But, which is important, his maximum pressure campaign was not tailored to create an atmosphere for regime change in Iran, but to force Iran to negotiation, to make them make their stance soften. So at the same time, he is a threat because his policy-making style is, let's say, not as stable as the previous one. But still, more chaotic. But still, we have to admit that old style wasn't able to resolve any of Middle Eastern conflict. So, if he will be able to force Israelis into forging kind of deal with Palestinians, and at the same time, if he will be able to extend his former Abraham Accords system, there will be a chance for a new chapter in the Middle East. But I think, although he will try, he will be unable to resolve anything.
So it seems like the policy. So it seems like the attitude is kind of like in Ukraine and everywhere else, where we kind of know what to expect. We were kind of disappointed the first time around, but also because we know that he's a wild card that's chaotic, we think that maybe some things will be resolved not even because he wants them to, but because his policies, combined with each other, just kind of make no sense and might result in something different. So that's interesting to know. Well, I guess my last question would be, what is your advice for now that Ukraine is starting to build, and I say this so responsibly, we have no relationship with the Middle East, and we really fumbled in that direction.
And that's a real chance for real. No colonial past, no imperial history. Free wild blank card in the Middle East, and very let's say very experienced military, which is also a huge asset in the Middle East, as Middle Eastern countries are always interested in military cooperation. That's a huge chance for Ukraine.
Well, hopefully this conversation was as productive and interesting to you as it was to me. I hope you learned a lot from it. And if you would like to hear more conversations like it, please don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Also, of course, turn on your notifications, send this video to a friend, give it a like, and leave your comments, questions, suggestions, and thoughts in the comment section down below, and I will be sure to read it. And of course, I'll see you next time.